Does this murder case really just come down to payback? So police in Heber Springs, Arkansas received a call on June 30th, 2016 from a woman named Candace Johnson. Candace and her husband Charles Johnson owned a business in Heber Springs called the Print Shop. The print shop was located on Highway 2B, and just after 12 o'clock on June 30th, 2016, Candace called 911 to report that a man came into her business and opened fire on her and her husband. That day before the shooting, Candace Johnson and her husband Charles were inside the business with their 3 grandchildren. The print shop actually had security cameras in place, and on that day, the security cameras actually captured a majority of what happened. So on that day, a gray Dodge flatbed truck pulled into the parking lot of the print shop, and a man got out of the truck and walked into the print shop. That man was wearing a blue t-shirt and blue jeans. The man had a black bag in his left hand, and in his right hand, he had a firearm. So this man walked straight into the print shop and aimed a .40 caliber semi-automatic high-point handgun at the Johnsons. The man said some things in anger to the Johnsons, and then he attempted to shoot them, but the gun misfired. The gun misfired, but the man didn't give up. Instead, he manually worked the slide on the handgun to load it. Then he raised it again and fired. When he fired at Charles Johnson, he struck Charles Johnson in his right thigh. When this happened, Candace Johnson automatically turned around and ran for her life. She ran to the back of the store, but the man followed her. The man caught up with Candace Johnson and fired 3 shots at her. Only one struck her, though. So Candace Johnson was hit in her abdominal area. He then went back to where Charles Johnson was. Charles Johnson was still alive at that point, and he fired one more shot at Charles Johnson that hit him in the upper chest area. The guy then just grabbed the black bag and walked out of the store, got in his vehicle, and drove away. Naturally, my curiosity was piqued, and I want to know what was in the black bag that he carried it in the building, but then carried it out of the building, and it doesn't seem like he ever actually opened the black bag. So what is the point in carrying it? But I can't find anything that says what the black bag really had to do with anything or why he had the black bag. So as if being on surveillance video wasn't enough for police to identify this man, Candace Johnson called 911, and she was able to tell police right away who the man was. So when police arrived at the scene, Candace Johnson told police that her and her husband were both shot by a man named David Hammonds. So a bolo was put out for David Hammonds. It seems like police were looking for him everywhere. They even called his adult daughter, who said that she hadn't seen or heard from her father in 2 days. But it wasn't until much later that night, like 9:30, that the state police actually received a call saying that David Hammonds was still driving the gray flatbed truck and had just left a residence in Swifton, Arkansas. Police were able to get behind David Hammonds, and David Hammonds led them on quite a high-speed chase. There were speeds in excess of 100 miles an hour, but even more than that, they deployed several spike strips trying to stop David Hammonds' vehicle, and they actually managed to flatten both tires on the right side of the vehicle, but David Hammonds just kept driving. Not only did he just keep driving, but he was also trying to run other troopers' vehicles off of the road. Finally, one of them was able to do a pit maneuver, and David Hammonds' vehicle was stopped. It ran into the median and turned over, but David Hammonds was finally off the road, and it turned out that he was fine. They did call an ambulance just to be safe, but David Hammonds said that he didn't want to be treated, so they just arrested him and took him to the jail. While there at the scene of the accident, David Hammonds' vehicle was searched, and police did find the .40 caliber weapon that was used in the shooting. David Hammonds was advised of his Miranda rights at the scene, but he made some interesting statements on the way to the White County Detention Center. David Hammonds actually asked the trooper, "Did those people die?" To which the trooper said, "Do what, sir?" And David Hammonds said, "Did those people die?" And the trooper was like, "What people?" To that, David Hammonds said, "The Johnsons, Charlie Johnson." And the trooper said, "Charlie Johnson?" And David Hammonds said, "Yeah, they got shot." Both Candace and Charlie Johnson were shot that day, and both were taken to the hospital by ambulance. But while doctors were able to save Candace Johnson, Charlie Johnson unfortunately died from his injuries. So the trooper told David Hammonds, "Yes, sir, I believe so. I'm not sure." And David Hammonds said, "What's a Capital One murder?" David Hammonds was interviewed at the White County Detention Center. One of the detectives asked him why he committed the crime at the print shop. And David Hammonds didn't answer verbally, but instead he lifted his shirt and showed the scar that was on his lower stomach. He said that Charlie Johnson had shot him 8 years prior, and his leg had not been the same since. After saying that, David Hammonds ended the interview. He was then taken to the Claiborne County Detention Center where he was interviewed again, and David Hammonds said, "I didn't think I'd ever do that, but look how many years it took for me to finally tick. I've been in pain ever since that son of a bee shot me." David Hammonds asked the trooper if he knew the backstory to what David Hammonds was talking about. Of course, the trooper didn't. And David Hammonds said that he had lost everything and that he'd been through a lot of stuff in the 2 months prior to the shooting. And so he decided that he was just going to, I guess, ruin his entire life. He actually said, "I was going for broke and I did it. I lit up like a Roman candle all the way." It does appear that David Hammonds' wife of 2 years filed for divorce 2 months before the shooting. So maybe that's one of the things that led to the shooting. We'll probably never actually know. David Hammonds was charged with capital murder, attempted capital murder, commercial burglary, and possession of firearms by a certain person. So going through the court process, David Hammonds was actually given a fitness to proceed exam. Apparently, after David Hammonds' arrest, he was sent to the Arkansas State Hospital twice. Once was because he was threatening to unalive himself there at the jail. And then there was a second time that he was sent for treatment at the state hospital. The doctor that did the assessment on David Hammonds found that David Hammonds was malingering, meaning he was faking his symptoms to make it seem like he was mentally unwell so that he couldn't be prosecuted. Joke's on him, because honestly, Arkansas really doesn't care that much about that. They will try repeatedly to prosecute people. Even if they are found to be mentally ill, they will send them to the state hospital and wait for them to get to a place where they can be mentally fit to be prosecuted. It does happen that some people are found not guilty by reason of insanity, but it takes a lot. And there are very few cases that I have seen that actually turn out that way. There are more cases that I have seen that a person is found to be unfit and is sent to the state hospital and reevaluated periodically. Maybe a year later, maybe a little bit more, they will actually become fit to stand trial. Regardless, obviously, I'm not a professional, certainly not a professional psychiatrist in any sort of manner, and can't say one way or the other, but something happened here in this case that I feel very uncomfortable with, and I'll tell you what that is. So the doctor that did the exam on David Hammonds felt like David Hammonds was malingering, but the prosecutors for Claiborne County actually contacted the doctor and just really gave their opinion of what they see from David Hammonds in court. Now, I don't really like that because, in my opinion, a prosecutor's job is to prosecute the person, and I don't feel like really invested in whether a person is mentally fit to stand trial or not. And of course, I could be wrong. Really, any and everything I say comes with that caveat. I could be wrong, but To me, this should be like separation of church and state. I don't feel like the prosecutor's opinions of David Hammonds or their experience with David Hammonds in the past has any bearing on what was going on at that current time with David Hammonds, and certainly shouldn't have influenced the doctor in any kind of way to make a finding one way or the other, which maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but it was included in the report, which makes me feel very uncomfortable. But again, maybe David Hammonds was malingering. I don't know. I just feel uncomfortable about the prosecuting office inserting themselves. But that's neither here nor there, because David Hammonds eventually took a plea deal. David Hammonds pled guilty to the charges that he was facing, and David Hammonds was actually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And oddly enough, for someone who looked like they were fighting having to go to prison, it doesn't appear that he's fighting to get out that much, because most people, especially when sentenced to life without parole or death, file appeals. But I haven't seen that David Hammonds has filed an appeal in his case. Maybe he has, and I just don't see it. But again, I just don't see where he has actually filed an appeal on his case. I tried to find more about the issues between David Hammonds and Charles Johnson, and I really couldn't find anything. It doesn't look like Charles Johnson had a criminal history. Charles Johnson started this print shop in 1974, and it had been in business for a long time. Charles Johnson was someone who had a military history, and he was actually the fire captain in his area. Thank you for watching this video. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share.